a generic version of the AIDS antiretroviral drug at a tiny fraction of the cost because we can find an Indian manufacturing company that figures out how the thing is made and produces it. And for a tiny fraction of the cost, we can save lives if we don't respect that patent. And then the American government said, no, here's a company that invested research and created this drug. You can't just start mass producing these drugs without paying a licensing fee. And so there was a dispute. And the pharmaceutical companies sued the South African government to try to prevent their buying the cheap, generic, as they saw it, pirated version of an AIDS drug. And eventually, the pharmaceutical industry gave in and said, all right, you can do that. But this dispute about what the rules of property should be, of intellectual property, of drug patenting, in a way is the last frontier of the state of nature, because among nations where there is no uniform law of patent rights and property rights, it's up for grabs until, by some act of consent, some international agreement, people enter into some settled rules. What about Locke's account of private property and how it can arise before government and before law comes on the scene? Is it successful? How many think it's pretty persuasive? Raise your hand. How many don't find it persuasive? All right, let's hear from some critics. What is wrong with Locke's account of how private property can arise without consent? Yes?
Yeah, I think it justifies European cultural norms as far as when you look at how Native Americans may not have cultivated American land, but by their arrival in the Americas, that contributed to the development of America, which wouldn't have otherwise necessarily happened then or by that specific group.
So you think that this is a defense, this defense of private property in land?
Yes, because it complicates original acquisition if you only cite the arrival of foreigners that cultivated the land.
I see. And what's your name?
Rochelle.
Rochelle?
Yeah.
Rochelle says this account of how property arises would fit what was going on in North America during the time of the European settlement. Do you think, Rochelle, that it's a way of defending the appropriation of the land?
Indeed, because I mean he's also justifying the Glorious Revolution, so I don't think it's inconceivable that he's also justifying colonization as well.
Well, it's an interesting historical suggestion, and I think there's a lot to be said for it. What do you think of the validity of his argument, though? Because if you're right that this would justify the taking of land in North America from Native Americans who didn't enclose it, if it's a good argument, then Locke's given us a justification for that. If it's a bad argument, then Locke's given us a mere rationalization that isn't morally defensible.
I'm leaning to the second
You're
one,
leaning
but
toward the second.
That's my opinion as well.
All right, well then let's hear if there's a defender of Locke's account of private property. And it would be interesting if they could address Rochelle's worry that this is just a way of defending the appropriation of land by the American colonists from the Native Americans who didn't enclose it. Is there someone who will defend Locke on that point? You ready? Are you going to defend Locke?
Like you're accusing him of justifying the European, basically, massacre of the Native Americans. But who says he's defending it? Maybe the European colonization isn't right. Maybe it's the state of war that he talked about in his second treatise,
So the wars between the Native Americans and the colonists, the settlers, that might have been a state of war that we can only emerge from by an agreement or an act of consent. And that's what would have been required.
Yeah, and
fairly
both
to resolve
sides
it.
would have had to agree to it and carry it out and everything.
But what about, and what's your name?
Dan?
But Dan, what about, Rochelle says this argument in section 27 and then in 32 about appropriating land, that argument, if it's valid, would justify the settlers appropriating that land and excluding others from it. You think that argument's a good argument?
Well, doesn't it kind of imply that the Native Americans hadn't already done that?
Well, the Native Americans as hunter-gatherers didn't actually enclose land. So I think Rochelle is onto something there. What I want to... Go ahead, Dan.
At the same time, he's saying that just by picking an acorn or taking an apple or maybe killing a buffalo on a certain amount of land, that makes it yours because it's your labor, and that's, your labor would enclose that land. So by that definition, maybe they didn't have fences around little plots of land, but didn't...
They were using it.
Yeah,
They were
by
using
Locke's
it.
definition.
So
because
maybe
they
by
mixed their
Locke's
labor.
definition, the Native Americans could have claimed a property right
Right.
in the land itself.
But they just didn't have Locke on their side, as
Good.
she points out.
Okay, that's good. One more defender of Locke. Go ahead.
Well, I mean, just to defend Locke, he does say that there are sometimes in which you can't take another person's land. For example, you can't acquire land that is common property. See, people in terms of American Indians, I feel like they already have civilizations themselves, and they were using land in common. So it's kind of like an analogy to what he was talking about with like the common English property. You can't take land that everybody's sharing in common.
Interesting.
And
That's
also,
interesting.
you can't take land unless you make sure that there's as much land as possible left for other people to take as well. So if you're taking so you have to make sure that whenever you take land, or that there's enough left for other people to use. That's
Right.
just as good as the land that you took. So.
That's true. Locke says there has to be this right to private property in the earth is subject to the provision that there be as much and as good left for others. What's your name?
Right. I'm Fang.
So Fang, in a way, agrees with Dan that maybe there is a claim within Locke's framework that could be developed on behalf of the Native Americans. Here's the further question. If the right to private property is natural, not conventional, if it's something that we acquire even before we agree to government, how does that right constrain what a legitimate government can do? In order finally to see whether Locke is an ally or potentially a critic of the libertarian idea of the state, we have to ask what becomes of our natural rights once we enter into society. We know that the way we enter into society is by consent, by agreement, to leave the state of nature and to be governed by the majority and by a system of laws, human laws. But those human laws are only legitimate if they respect our natural rights, if they respect our unalienable rights to life, liberty, and property. No parliament, no legislature, however democratic its credentials, can legitimately violate our natural rights. This idea that no law can violate our right to life, liberty, and property would seem to support the idea of a government so limited that it would gladden the heart of the libertarian after all. But those hearts should not be so quickly gladdened, because even though for Locke the law of nature persists once government arrives, even though Locke insists on limited government, government limited by the end for which it was created, namely the preservation of property. Even so, there's an important sense in which what counts as my property, what counts as respecting my life and liberty, are for the government to define. That there be property, that there be respect for life and liberty is what limits government. But what counts as respecting my life and respecting my property, that is for governments to decide and to define. How can that be? Is Locke contradicting himself? Or is there an important distinction here? In order to answer that question, which will decide Locke's fit with the libertarian view, we need to look closely at what legitimate government looks like for Locke, and we turn to that next time. Nikolai, if you didn't think you'd get caught, would you pay your taxes?
I don't think so. I would rather have a system personally that I could give money to exactly those sections of the government that I support and not just blanket support everything.
You'd rather be in the state of nature, at least
Exactly.
on April 15th. Last time, we began to discuss Locke's state of nature, his account of private property, his theory of legitimate government, which is government based on consent and also limited government. Locke believes in certain fundamental rights that constrain what government can do, and he believes that those rights are natural rights, not rights that flow from law or from government. And so Locke's great philosophical experiment is to see if he can give an account of how there could be a right to private property without consent before government and legislators arrive on the scene to define property. That's his question. That's his claim. There is a way, Locke argues, to create property, not just in the things we gather and hunt, but in the land itself, provided there is enough and is good left for others. Today I want to turn to the question of consent, which is Locke's second big idea. Private property is one, consent is the other. What is the work of consent? People here have been invoking the idea of consent since we began, since the first